And John, I think a lot of people probably in the call knows John's work. He pioneered a lot of work around the design theory. I think I got to know John through one of our colleague, Human, who talked about the conference John put together, which is the DCC, Design Cognitive Cognition and Computing. And I attended a workshop John held during the pandemic and got to know the community. And since then, I've in my research work, I've quoted John's work around function, behavior, structure, which are like very useful when you're thinking about design, analyzing design, or developing new tools for design, as well as like hosting workshops at DCC. And recently, I attended DCC this past summer in Montreal. And in one workshop, we got reconnected and talked a lot about some of the changes with AI, but also like new means to study humans with cognitive science, with fMRI, and so on. So I'm really excited to have John here to share some of his new research and get enlightened. And I think John said, like, if you guys have questions, feel free to ask at any time. And also we'll leave some time for questions at the end. Yeah, take it away, John.
Okay, so let's start off with the standard question. Can you see my screen? Yes. Okay. So what I want to do is to tell you a little bit about how we can find out more about designing by studying humans, and in particular, neurocognition. So let's start with that. So what is neurocognition? Neurocognition has two parts to it, not unsurprisingly. One is cognition, which is founded in cognitive science, which deals with what happens in the mind. So cognitive science aims to develop models and structures of what happens in the mind. It doesn't look into the mind, it looks at what the mind tells us. Neuroscience, on the other hand, looks at what happens in the brain and looks into the brain. And neurocognition is looking into the brain and finding something about what happens in the mind. So that's what I want to talk about. Now, interestingly enough, and probably fortunately, if you were to cut a designer's head open, you're not going to find thought. What you're going to find is massive stuff, physical stuff, but you won't see thought, which actually is probably a good thing because someone might be tempted to cut open your head and see what you're thinking. But what we can do is find out what's happening in the brain by looking at where activations occur, where there's change. And that's sort of what this does. This looks inside the brain or some aspect of the brain and finds out what's happening in the brain when you're doing things like designing. So let me tell you a little bit more about that. But the first thing to find out is that unlike physics, the brain and cognition in particular is not superpositional. What on earth does that mean? Superpositional. What it means is if I do A and I measure what happens, and I do B and I measure what happens, if I do A and B together, I don't get anything to do with A or B necessarily. So this is very different to, putting a load onto a beam and you can measure the stress You can put another load on the beam and measure the stress. And when you put the two loads on, the stress is just the sum of the stresses of the individual loads. And we can show this. So what have we got here? On the left, we have a VR of one condition in a lecture theatre. And above it, we have, looking down on the brain, a network of which parts of the brain are connected or activated at the same time while they're looking at this. Whoops, that's not it. Next to it is another condition. It's the same space, but with a different treatment, and it has a different network. But when we have both treatments, this is biophilic design, the network that's produced is not derivable from the individual networks. Now, what this tells us is a lot of brain science and neuroscience is actually not going to help us all that much if we're looking in the design world. And that's what I want to talk about. So one of the questions we are often asked is problem solving different to designing? And problem solving we define as where the problem is well structured and understood, and we know what the answer might look like and how to assess when we've got there. Designing looks a bit different to that. In designing, a lot of what you do is deciding what the problem is and how the problem changes as you design. And the question is this real or is this something people say? So what have we got here? We have a spider or radar or polar plot, and it's got some labels on the outside, so it's actually symmetric. So this is looking down on the brain. And these labels are the standard labels used for different places where you put electrodes in an EEG system to measure brain activity. And then this just measures the amount of activity. And what we have here is the orange one is problem solving, and we're comparing everything to that. And what we have is a series of experiments where we go from problem solving, we open it up until we just get to open designing, which is the blue. And we can see that the brain activates very differently when you're designing compared to problem solving. At the same time, we also look, these are professional engineers and industrial designers, and it turns out industrial designers' brains respond differently to the same task compared to mechanical engineers. What we see here is that industrial designers have higher activations in their brains than mechanical engineers. Why this is, we don't know. If you're a mechanical engineer, it could be that, well, you know, you're just more efficient than those industrial designers. If you're an industrial designer, you might say, well, those engineers, you know, they're pretty lazy. They don't activate much. We don't know. But we have some base knowledge here to start investigating this. Something people often ask is, you know, is the left hemisphere the creative or the right hemisphere? It's not that simple. This is an experiment on brainstorming, and the horizontal axis is a design session divided into 10 equal time periods, deciles. And the vertical axis is the percentage of activation in the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Adds up always to 100%, right? And what we see is that in brainstorming, in the beginning, we have left hemisphere dominance, and then it sort of fluctuates. If you're interested, this uses a method called functional near-infrared spectroscopy. What is that? It turns out that near-infrared light passes through the skull unchanged. Interesting, right? So what this thing does is it fires light through the skull into the brain and measures the reflectance. And some very smart physiologists and mathematicians have worked out how to connect that with the amount of activation in where that light has been shone. And that's how we're getting this. But if you use morphological analysis as a design tool, and it doesn't matter if you don't know what that is, it's a different tool, it turns out the brain responds differently. And if you use TRIZ, it responds very differently again. So it's a little simplistic to say, oh, left brain this, right brain that. Now, one of the things we do is, of course, we use different media to present our ideas. What's the effect of that? And hopefully, so at the top, oh, this is really giving us fun, isn't it? All right. On the top, we have someone looking at the same image in VR as the person on the bottom is looking at that image on a desktop display. And on the right-hand side are heat maps. A heat map is just simply mapping on to colors the levels of activation of different regions of the brain. And the way to interpret this is red means lots of high activation, green means almost, or orange actually means no change, green means less activation, and blue means a lot less activation. And we can see that looking in VR, the brain activates very differently than looking at the same image on a desktop display. So right there, we need to be cognizant of this, and this is not the time to go into it, and make use of this in the way in which we expect people to use what we do. And you can see this at a more detailed level. These are neural networks, not the computational kind, but the physical kind. This is the network of connections of people using the computer display, and this is the network of connections people using VR. And again, we see differences. And we can go into these anatomical regions and connect those to cognition. I mean, Autodesk is actually all about offloading cognition. What does offloading cognition mean? It means instead of doing it in your head, you do it outside. I mean, that's the foundation for Autodesk. It's a foundation from which you build. The question is, does this really change cognition when you offload cognition? And let's have a look. We're going to offload cognition by using a concept map. Concept map is a very unsophisticated, but a very useful thinking tool where you write concepts down and link them. So here's some work, brainstorming, no concept map for a design task, and across a whole session, and we can see that there's roughly equal amounts of activation, not hugely high, and not much in the middle. If we use a concept map, our brain changes quite dramatically what it does. It shifts all its activity to the right hemisphere and to the extreme right over here somewhere, and reduces, because blue is less than before, reduces what happened before. And if you add up all the activation, you've discovered that this has a lot less than that. So offloading cognition changes the way you work, or the way your brain works, and reduces the amount of effort. Well, what happens if we use ChatGPT as our offloading cognition? So here's the activations across the prefrontal cortex, this part, the forehead and a little bit back, when we're thinking about the problem. And then when we're coming up with ideas, it focuses more in the middle. Let's repeat this. This is for a large number of people, by the way. With ChatGPT, when we're using it to come up with, tell us about constraints and so on, it changes and reduces the level of activity. But the more dramatic one is when you use GPT to come up with ideas. Basically, what happens is your brain does very little. Now, what's the implication of that? I don't know. Nobody knows. Because no one has ever seen this before. Right? This is knowledge that didn't exist before. Now, one interpretation is, well, since your brain doesn't have to work anymore, and the brain, like every other part of the world, is an energy minimizer, it does less and less. And you can project the effect of that is your brain will turn to mush. I don't think that's what's going to happen, but that's one projection. By the way, Socrates, if you remember Socrates from 300 BC, who invented a lot of the ideas that Western civilization is built on, complained about something very similar. He complained that Plato was writing down his ideas, and the effect of this would be that Socrates' students wouldn't need to think anymore. And that would be the end of the world. It turns out, writing down ideas was a really good idea itself. So you've got to be careful. All right. We teach different design methods. Does that change brain behavior? So what is this? This is looking at the brain and tracking which part of the brain is most active as we design. And in brainstorming, it starts here. The colors refer to anatomical features. It's really the numbers. And it sort of runs around, but you notice it crosses from left to right and back. Morphological analysis actually hovers in different places on either side of the brain. And TRIZ, I don't know if people know TRIZ, but TRIZ is a very different kind of design support tool invented by a Russian, and it's really the only Russian system used in the West. And look what it does. It forces people to have their brain activity almost entirely in the left side of the brain. Now, what's interesting is that TRIZ produces, people who use TRIZ produce designs that are consistently ranked as much more creative than using brainstorming. And we can connect these different parts of the prefrontal cortex to design acts or just cognitive acts. So now we're connecting the mind and the brain. And designing, a lot of neuroscience and cognitive science is done on what is called rehearsal tasks. You give someone a task and they repeat it. They rehearse it many times, and you get to know a lot about the response for that. But designing is not like that. Designing involves lots and lots of cognitive actions. And just reading the brief, reading the program, your brain responds. That's already part of designing. Just reading it. Actually, if you tell people you're going to give them a design task, their brain starts to look like they're designing without having seen anything. Just be told that. Anyway, if you then start formulating it and framing it, what is this thing going to look like? The whole what are the variables? What are the values? What are the criteria? It changes and it shifts its focus to a different part of the brain, because that's where the prefrontal cortex, the thinking, reasoning part of the brain, that's where that occurs. And when you decide how you're going to do things, you notice much less activity involved. And then designing sits at this intersection, this medial prefrontal cortex, coming up, when I say designing, I mean synthesizing, coming up with ideas. We can capture all of this. We can see this. We can show that these claims that, synthesis is different to formulation is grounded in objective truth, or as close to objective truth as we can get. Now, one of the things we do is we sort of assume, certainly in our education, that everyone is the same. Well, here's a little test to see whether, in fact, people are different. I don't mean individually. So what we did is this. We got everyone to do the psychometric creativity tests, which are not fantastically good, but they're not bad. And we took a sample of people who performed in the top quartile and a sample of people who performed in the bottom quartile and gave them the same task, design task. And this is what we got. Those who are much more creative had more activations in their brain than those who are judged to be less creative. And their designs match this. More creative people produced more creative designs and less creative people. I'm talking statistically here. Maybe what this tells us is we need different kinds of tools or different implementations of tools for different people. That we shouldn't have the same tool for everybody. Now, of course, we have designers working together, and one of the things we find is that as people work together, they get more efficient. What is meant by more efficient? They consume less resources, generally less time to reach an agreed point. However, this comes at a cost. And the cost is that the range of designs they produce gets to be narrowed down. Very few teams that have worked together produce very, very creative designs. Now, you can't say that in a blanket way, but you can say it generally. So what is the basis for the fact that this happens? And the question is, maybe their brains start to move in synchrony. All right? So here's a team of two. The thing they're wearing is an FNIRS headset that captures their brain activity. This is the stuff that throws near infrared light rays into your brain and measures the reflection. And what do we get? That after a while, not for every team, but for teams in general, certain regions of the brain start to act synchronously. This thing is hard to interpret because it's a technical graph, but basically where these highlights are is where these two brains are acting synchronously across time. And now we have a biological, physiological explanation for some of the things we observe behaviorally. Now, you mentioned fMRI, which is the thing most people have heard about when they think about brain studies, functional magnetoresonance imaging. And that uses a different approach. What it does is it pumps a very large magnetic field through your brain. And what that does is it takes the water molecules and the ions in those and polarizes them so they line up in certain ways. Water molecules are in your blood. It's the blood flow that can be extracted from that. Your blood transports oxygen, which is the energy needed for cells, and the brain cells need energy as much as any other cell. And the more energy they demand, the more oxygen flows there and the more water is flowing as part of the blood. So now we can measure the oxygen demand and correlate that with cognitive activity in the brain. So that's what fMRI does. The trouble is, normally you're stuck there and that's all you can do. So we develop techniques that allow us to sketch. The person has a TV screen or a computer screen above them that they can see, and we get them to verbalize or think aloud. So we do brain scans while they're reading and sketch drawing and talking. And this has never been done before, right? Because now we have the ability to look at the brain, look at what they're doing, look at the output, and listen to what they're saying, which gives us access to thought. And what do we find? Well, this is part of a much bigger study that if you're going to work in the graphic domain, you need to know something about how people interpret that. And the way they interpret it is a function of how they learn about things. And psychologists have developed a reasonably robust division of learning styles, and the two are abstract learners and exemplar learners. What are they? Abstract learners are people who, looking at examples, are able to abstract something separate from the examples. So they no longer need the examples. Exemplar learners are those who work with examples. Now, what we wanted to do as part of a different project, we needed to know this to see, is this claim about these two styles of learning real? Or is it just, people make stuff up and sometimes it's not there? So what do we see here? This is the brain. So on the left, we take the activations of the abstract learners, so the other way around, the activations of the exemplar learners, and take them away from the activations of the abstract learners, and whatever's left is the difference between them. And what we see is there's different regions of the brain where there are differences. And if we reverse it, we take the abstract learners' activations from the exemplar learners, we see actually it's quite different. So now we have evidence that these two methods of learning are actually quite different. And that's important for us because when you're designing, we want to see if that could be part of the explanation for some of the things that's happening. And on the right-hand side is when we give people an image for the task that the control problem is. So let me explain that very quickly. What the control problem is a verbal prompt for a design. On the right-hand side, these people got the same verbal prompt and an image which said, this is the level of detail we want you to produce. But it so happens the image is a design for the prompt. And the design has three features: good ideas, ideas that don't work, can't work, and irrelevant ideas like the tile pattern in the background. And this is an experiment that allows us to see whether people get fixated on what they're shown. And the answer is yes, they do. But it turns out people who are abstract learners have a different response than exemplar learners. And now it turns out we need to tune how we interact with such people, something we didn't know before. This stuff is not yet published, so we have a way to go. One of the things that we found to be very useful is to have an ontology to talk about designs and designing. And if you look up ontology clearly is a Greek word. Ology is the study of. Ont, I guess. Ont is the Greek word for being. So in traditional Greek, this would be the study of existence, say. But in computer science, it has a different meaning. In computer science, it means something like the framework for knowledge. It's sort of like meta-knowledge, but it's a bit more than that. It's a framework within which knowledge fits. And we're accustomed to this. I mean, we build ontologies all the time. If I say furniture and then I say table, well, clearly table belongs to furniture. But that's a very special kind of ontology where one is has a mereological relation to the other. Ontologies normally are used to describe a world where the ontological variables don't overlap. And a useful ontology in design has been this function, behavior, structure ontology. Function is the purpose of things. It's their teleology, if you want the Greek word. Behavior is how things work or could work, and structure is what the thing is, elements and their relationships. And one of the interesting things is that function and structure have no natural connection. So that meets the ontological requirement of being different. And behavior is not a part of function. Behavior is derivable from structure. But let's not worry about this. It's just an ontology that has been used in a lot of places. And the question comes, does this cognitive ontology have any basis? Well, here's the sort of thing you might see on a doctor's wall. What this is brain scans of multiple people who are designing and talking using that protocol I showed earlier. And every time they say function, we look to see if a unique part of the brain lights up. Now, I don't know if you can see it, but there's red areas just here, here, here. Doesn't matter if you can see it or not. You have to believe me because they're there, right? And those are not there when they're talking about something else. It's not enough that they be there. And when they talk about behavior, we get different parts of the brain lighting up. Right? So behavior is in a different part of the brain. And then structure is even in another part of the brain, much further down in the brain. So it turns out that these cognitive constructs, which people make up, have a neurophysiological foundation, which is found afterwards. So what can we do with all this? Well, here's one idea, right? And the idea is really simple and hard to believe. If I show you a heat map of your brain while you're coming up with ideas, and normally the medial prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain, is most active when you're coming up with an idea. So that shows as red. So I'm going to show you your brain in real time with a heat map of activations. And what I say is this, 4 words. Keep that part red. That's it. Nothing else. And what do you get? Each one of these horizontal things is one person. On the left-hand side is just the left brain, right brain dominance before we tell you this while you're designing. And then we say, keep that part red, and look what happens. Suddenly, there's a shift. This is a different person, another person, but all of them change their behavior, and you get something unbelievable. They double the number of ideas they're capable of producing. And we've done this now with undergraduates, graduates, practitioners, actually engineering equipment salesmen. And we get the same result. I mean, the number may vary a little bit. So, and this is called self-regulation. Humans have this ability to change their behavior without knowing how to do it. So, where does this leave us? There's an entire world out there which we're just starting to find out about. It's a world where we have much more objective results than anything else. We're using machines to make measurements, and everyone else can use the same machine or different, and they get roughly the same. That's very unusual when you're dealing with humans. And this is just the beginning. Clearly, there's a lot of opportunity here for all sorts of activity. So, for example, we have built or playing with interfaces where an AI doesn't respond to you, it responds to your brain, responding to it. Or we look at interfaces where we look at your face and extract emotions from that, and that's another channel. And of course, we have brain-computer interfaces. And they're pretty interesting. So let me leave you with, here's this amazing world, the most complex thing we know about. And we're just now starting to be able to discover, and I use that word advisedly, to discover what's happening there in the world that we're interested in, which is designing. And let me thank these nice people who provide money for this. And I'll stop there.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much, John. Yeah, and if you have any questions for John. I have, go ahead, Danny.
I was just gonna.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question. Maybe I'll jump in. Sorry, Ray. Yeah, thanks, Professor, for taking the time to share the work with us. It was a real treat. I guess my first question is, I guess at a high level, I was wondering if, what do you think is the biggest factor that is holding design tools back today? I'm wondering whether, I guess, we're a design company, we make design tools. You've been studying how people react to different design methods. I think that there is a lot of, is it the collaborative aspect? You shared a little bit about how there's synchronicity between people as they collaborate. Maybe our tools aren't able to do that as well as we would like, or is it more how we interact with the computer? You've talked a little bit about different HCI and possible venues for even brain connections and things like that, or is it more around kind of the data model? For example, when it comes to the function behavior structure ontology, I don't think there are many tools out there today that really leverage this ontology to its full extent. So I guess it's some kind of an open question.
I think there's many, many factors. There's no silver bullet here. The first one is people are highly conservative. So that's the first one. The second is almost all of these have high learning curves and interfaces that need to be learned. And we've seen over the last year and a half, 2 years, that if you can remove the interface completely, you get something else. And that's what ChatGPT did. There's no interface. I mean, there's a window, but you talk to it and it talks back. Maybe you have to type. So using natural language removes that. Of course, in designing, that's a little harder because we use other languages, mainly graphical languages. And there's a lot of work being done and still being done on interpreting that. So that's the second. The third is, designing is taught as a very high level human activity that is highly valued in a humanocentric way. When a human does it, it's more valuable than when a machine does it. And this applies not just to this, but to all things. I mean, when I was in high school, you were considered very smart if you could multiply numbers together in your head, right? Particularly if they were bigger than 2 digits, even 2 digits, 65 by 32. If you could multiply that, and there were people who could multiply 4-digit numbers together in their head, right? Today, if you said, I can multiply 2 numbers together in my head, you would say, who cares? Why are you telling me this, right? So what do we get from this is that our value systems in relation to our capabilities are constantly changing, right? And we've seen it with CAD modeling and CAD, well, starting off with CAD drafting. In the 60s, no one was allowed to submit to an art competition any computer generated anything, right? Today, it's a moot question as to what's going on. It's just, but humans are, I think, humanocentric. Designing reinforces that. When we built, AI isn't new. In the 80s, there was this huge wave where we thought the world would change, and they were called expert systems then. And we built expert systems that generated designs on demand. All you needed to do was to put in the knowledge, except in those days, the knowledge was in the form of rules, not in the form of deep neural networks. There was one big difference, that you could examine a rule. And if you wanted a Frank Lloyd Wright prairie house that had more bedrooms than ever he produced, it would generate one for you on demand. And we did it for all sorts of things. I mean, we did Mondrian paintings. We used a learning method which we developed called genetic engineering, where we found the genes that go to make up the rules. And then you could execute those. And then because they're genes, you could mix parents. So you could have Frank Lloyd Wright and Mondrian. And we produce things, I mean, the machine at our instruction produced things like Flandrians. But what happened was that people didn't value that as highly, although a Flandrian had never existed before. So coming back, it's not enough that a tool really do something. It's got to be accepted. And often tools change power structures in organizations. I mean, I had a consulting practice that dealt with bringing CAD systems into offices. And one of the big complaints of design partners were that these young upstarts who are running it seemed to know more than they did. And they didn't like that, right? Today, running a CAD system is not of interest. Everyone's meant to be able to use it as a tool. So there's this learning curve that involves a change of values. That's I think, the critical part. Long answer to a tough question.
Oh yeah, thanks. Appreciate it.
Ray, I saw you raise your hand earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I have a couple of questions if there's time. First, yeah, thanks so much for such a fascinating talk. I was curious about, you're both in the computer science field as well as the architecture field, and maybe the first question is, are you currently doing, or do you know of other labs doing this very specific like neurocognitive studies that's targeted directly towards either the built environment or architecture versus like
Yes.
the design process, for example?
Well, if we broaden it to design,
Mm-hmm.
yes, there's a group at Berkeley. There's a group at CMU. There's a group, I mean, sometimes they're just an individual, but there's a group at Milan Polytechnic. There's quite a nice group at University of Strathclyde in Scotland. And there's startups all over. By startups, I mean one young professor, assistant professor, in lots and lots of places around the US and around the world. And that's because EEG caps now are really cheap. I mean, you get what you pay for, but the first one I bought, in fact, it was easier to buy it out of petty cash than go through the university, right? Because it was $895, right? And in fact, the second slide I showed about the mechanical engineers and industrial designers and problem solving was done with, all of that was done with an $895 device. Today they're $1,000, $1,200. And then, I mean, you wouldn't do neuroscience with it, but we're not doing neuroscience. No, we're doing design science. So that's the first thing, that the cost of these devices has really become affordable. Even FNIRS, which costs $30,000, is not outrageous if you're running a lab, right? The second thing is the software to do the analysis has now become either open source or you can buy it for not extraordinary amounts of money. So those two things make this kind of work accessible. A lot of it's driven originally from medicine, but today it's driven by marketing because that's where the money is, and politics, not politicians, but people who might think of political marketing. So if there's a lot of, like, here's an interesting thing just to finish off. There is a society for the neuroscience of creativity, just focusing on creativity. And, our work fits into that. We present there. Its conferences get 150 people, right? That's a respectable number for what sounds like a very niche topic. But I think you will find that more engineering schools, but design schools will increasingly start to do some work of this kind. The reason I say engineering schools is because even $1,200 for some design schools seems like a lot, and $30,000 seems like a lot. But an NSF grant will give you $30,000 for equipment. I mean, we have a grant where we bought. You saw those two students working together. That's an NSF funded project.
Thanks. And maybe a quick follow-up. Related to the two students working together, we've actually looked a little bit at, hyperscanning with EEGs to think about how we measure collaboration. But recently, it's interesting because there's kind of like, okay, designer to designer collaboration. But a lot of times it's not the designer that needs to make better decisions per se, but it's getting the designer and their end user kind of, in sync, right? Or the designer and the client, because they're operating at very different modes of thinking, right? The designers together are already, tuned to be in sync. So have you, done studies related to this, or do you know of studies that
I'm not
done these
aware of
kind of
any
comparisons?
actual studies. I have a group in Italy where we're looking at cooperation and competition. And one of the proposed experiments is of this kind. It's a 3-person hyperscanning environment we've just generated there, where we look at the difference between a design team with and without a client as part of it, on the basis that a client is actually has a mixed relationship with the designer because they have other goals. In fact, I saw a beautiful cartoon, which actually I commissioned by a very famous cartoonist who said he could represent any idea. I said, well, can you represent, a client talking to an architect? And so what he produced, he draws very spare sticks-like figures. He's got a table, the architect on one side and the client on the other, and in the bubble above the architect is sort of an image of the Sydney Opera House, and in the bubble above the client is a stack of dollar notes. Right? The question, are they ever in sync, really? We don't. So that would be interesting. But I don't actually know of anyone doing that work. Would be very interesting. If you want to do it, we should talk.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, really great presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Just to give a little bit background, raised from our architecture industry futures. So yeah, like their team are based in New York and have a lot of experience both in computer science as well as in architecture.
Well, it's a good area to be in today.
Definitely. So I posted John's website in the chat. So if people want to reach out to John, feel free to. And thank you so much, John, for the inspiring talk. And we'll keep in touch.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much.